In this tutorial, I will explain how to consume web services exposed by other applications in ORAM. I will also show how to expose a web service from your ORAM application to the outside world. Let's start with an example of consuming a web service from some web application. I will use a web service of a popular service provider called webservicex.net. This is their website. And I will use their service that returns stock price for a provided stock symbol. This is the service that we want to call. So here I have created a blank application, and in this application our goal is to get the user to enter the stock symbol and display the price of the entered symbol. First of all, we need to create a business object representing our service provider, webservicex.net. So I start by creating a business object, webservicex.net, and I need to provide at least one attribute for this object. Otherwise, ORAM will not create it. I really don't need any attributes in this object, but I'll create one, for example, name. Our service provider object must be intelligent, so I tick the intelligence checkbox and select the intelligence type, software system. So here I get a list of channels that correspond to this intelligence type. One of them is the SOAP channel, and this is the one I need to consume a web service. I mark this channel as active and default, and I click on the Edit button to enter the settings of the channel. Here I need to specify the URL of the WSDL file that describes web services that we need. Every service provider has such a file, and if you need to use their web services, you need to inquire about the location of the file. I go to their website, and sure enough, I see the URL of the WSDL file. So I copy this URL and paste it into our dialog here. Then I click OK. Now I can discover web services exposed at this URL. To do this, I click the Discover button, and ORAM automatically creates a list of services with business objects representing parameters and reply of the service. As you can see, ORAM has created one web service with one parameter and one reply object. Let's have a look at them. So the parameter object has the symbol attribute, which obviously stores the value of the stock symbol. The reply object has the getQuoteResult attribute, which presumably contains the price of the stock. By default, ORAM will save both objects in the database, but for my purposes, I will just create a parameter on the fly and display the result. So I don't need to persist these objects in the database, and I will change the persistence options of both objects to not persisted. Now that we have web services discovered and all parameters and replies created, we need to write a process that would let the user enter the symbol, call the service, and display the result. So I create a new process, getStockPrice. Before I can ask the user to enter the symbol, I have to make sure that there is an instance of the service provider object in the system. We only need one instance of this object. We could create it during system initialization, but here for simplicity I will create one on the fly if it has not been already created. So my first rule will be if there is no webservicex.net object yet, create one on the fly. Now we can ask the user to enter the symbol. The rule will create an instance of the parameter object. And now we need to call the service. We use request service action for this. After the service has been called, it should put the reply object into the context, so we can use it, which means that our last rule will display the price to the user. That's it. We can now put our application under test and test it in the browser. So we'll log into the application using the browser. And we use the standard system functionality to run our process. As expected, the first thing it does, it asks us for the stock symbol. I have polished the form of the object behind the scenes a little bit to make it look nicer. So I enter the stock symbol, click Get Quote, the service is called, and the price is returned. So as you can see, calling web services is not that hard at all. Let's now expose a web service to the outside world. I will use some real application here. For example, the issue resolution application. Let's say that we want to expose to the outside world the service that returns the number of outstanding issues, resolved bugs, and other statistics at the time of the service call. Luckily, in the issue resolution application, we already have most of what we need. There is the progress record business object that stores the values that we need to expose to the outside world. This object has business rules that calculate those values. There is only one instance of this object in the system. There is a scheduling rule that recreates this object every night and recalculates the required values. So all we have to do in the service is find an instance of this object and return it. Simple enough. To expose a web service to the outside world, we need to define an AwareIM service. Before we can do this, however, we need to define a process that will implement our service. So let's create a process that will find the progress record and return it. I create a process called getSystemStats, and since there is only one instance of the progress record object in the system, we can just find all instances. So our first rule is find all progress record. How do we return this object? We don't. All we need to do is populate the context with the object or objects that we want to return, and the service mechanism will do the rest. So our process is ready. Now we can define the service. I create a service also called getSystemStats, and the implementing process of the service will be our process. And here we specify that the type of the object returned by the service is progress record. Once the service runs, AwareIM will search the context for one or more instances of this object if return multiple instances is ticked, and then it will automatically return it. Now we need to select the technology that the service will be exposed with. It can be exposed as a SOAP web service, or as a RESTful service, or both. The technology will define how the outside world will be accessing the service. With a SOAP web service, a WebAIM will automatically generate a special file in a WSDL format that the outside world will call, just like we called the service of webservicex.net. The URL of this file will be, so the outside world will just need to call this URL and provide parameters of the service according to the format of this file. You don't need to know anything about it. All you have to do is make sure that the above URL is known to the outside world. So SOAP web service support is selected by default, and there is nothing else to configure here for SOAP services. So our service is ready. One important thing that we need to mention here is to get a WebAIM to actually expose the SOAP service, we must publish the version and then log in to the browser as system administrator at least once. It is during this initial login that web services will actually get exposed and the WSDL file gets generated. Let's now talk about RESTful services, which become more and more popular. With a RESTful service, the outside world provides all the parameters of the service through a URL and immediately gets a reply from this call. So your service name and parameters of the service are encoded in the URL itself. If you select the default URL mapping here, a WebAIM will expose the service at the following URL. Where parameters include the name of the attribute and the value. For example, we actually do not have parameters for our service, but if the process that implements the service required an object as process input and only one is allowed, then that's how the call to the URL would look like to the outside world. The values of the attributes of this object have to be provided as parameters in the URL. The name of the parameters must match the names of the attributes of the object. If this, however, is not possible for whatever reason, then you need to provide a mapping between the names of the parameters, or external name, and the name of the corresponding attribute. You should only do it for those parameters that have different names to the names of the attributes. If the default URL cannot be used, you can construct your own URL by choosing the URL must contain string option here, and then provide your own custom string. For example, if you provide the following string, the following URL can be used. Note that if you choose this option, you must also provide a file called rest.props and put it in the bin directory of your WebAIM installation. The file must have a string that specifies the name of the business space containing the RESTful service. For example, domain equals issue resolution. If a RESTful service returns a reply, it can be either in the XML format or in JSON format. The format can also vary depending on the URL used. The extension of the expected format can be specified in the URL itself. Choose the appropriate option here. If values of the attributes of the returned object are undefined, you can choose how a WebAIM will encode such values. By default, a WebAIM will skip undefined values. Do not encode option. But you can also encode an empty value or a particular string. You can also specify different encoding options depending on the name of the attribute. For a RESTful service, you do not need to log in as an administrator because there is no WSDL file to generate. The URL of the service becomes available to the outside world as soon as you publish your business space version.